Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another session for HistoryFest, coming up to the end of the festival now, with a week-long series of sessions. Thank you to those of you that have been to any earlier in the week. We hope you've enjoyed them. If this is your first event, hello, welcome. Bit of housekeeping for you, but don't worry too much because it's not what you normally expect. So, for example, shouldn't have any fire drills, but if you do, please make sure you don't hang around for us. Get out. But other than that, you won't need to unmute your microphone. If you'd like to tell anything to us, if you'd like to ask any questions, you can type it into the chat, and I will pass those on to John. If there's anything vitally important regarding tech issues or anything like that, I will try and help you out whilst John is talking. You don't need to show us your face either, so don't worry about enabling video cameras or anything like that. You can just sit back, relax, and enjoy the session. If there is anything else you want to ask us while we're talking, please feel free. It's something that I might be able to type away an answer to. Otherwise, we'll just wait till the end so that John can answer those. Other than that, most important thing is to just make sure you enjoy the session and really make the most of it. So without further ado, I will hand over to John.
Thanks very much, Rob. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this History Festival and also for joining us for this short lecture about Soviet history. What I would like to talk to you about today is a key element of Stalin's Russia. It's the economic reconstruction that took place across the 1930s after Stalin launched what became known as his revolution from above. Now, the system that was built in the 1930s left the Soviet Union strong enough to defeat the Nazis in the 1940s and also advanced enough to become a nuclear superpower by the end of the 1940s. But this came with a very high human cost. There was an enormous human cost to pay for Soviet modernisation. So here we'll focus on industrialisation and collectivisation and think about some of the problems that Soviet citizens had to face during the massive reorganisation of the economy, of society, of politics, of culture, whilst the Soviet Union and whilst Stalin was laying the basis for this system that would last, broadly speaking, until the mid-1980s, until Mikhail Gorbachev began to reconstruct his own, reconstruct the economy and society during his own perestroika reforms. And one thing that we can discuss at the end is the question of whether Stalin successfully built socialism and successfully built a socialist economy in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Now, to start with, in 1928-29, the idea that there was a great turn occurring became prevalent. Stalin's Communist Party now began to break with Vladimir Lenin's legacy of NEP, the new economic policy that Lenin had introduced at the start of the 1920s, where he brought back elements of market forces, elements of capitalism. And Lenin had also sought to forge an alliance with the peasantry. But NEP began to slow down by the late 1920s, and now the Communist Party turned to rapid industrialisation. The emphasis here was on building a great and strong planned economy. And this would be based on heavy industry and industrialisation and collective farms. And the emphasis here was on speed. There was no time for slacking the pace of modernisation. In November 1929, Stalin said that the Soviet Union was advancing full steam ahead along the path of industrialisation to socialism. The USSR was leaving behind the age-old Russian backwardness. The Soviet Union was becoming a country of metal, a country of automobiles, of tractors. And Stalin said once the Soviet Union was on an automobile, once the peasant was on a tractor, he challenged the so-called worthy capitalists, as he called them, who, he said, boast of their civilization. He challenged them to overtake the Soviet Union. He said, we shall yet see which countries may then be classified as backward and which as advanced. 2 years later, catching up and overtaking the West was still fundamentally important. Stalin's fears, his concerns that had helped to shape his thoughts in the 1920s still greatly concerned him in the 1930s. These concerns were obvious from a speech that he gave in 1931 to the first All-Union Congress of Managers of Socialist Industry. In this speech, which is called The Tasks of Business Executives, Stalin set his priorities as the Soviet Union began to construct a more modern economic basis based on heavy industry and state planning. Now, for much of the speech, Stalin spoke of the economic tasks that lay ahead for those who are involved in the newly industrializing Soviet sector. He made it clear here that the speed of this reconstruction would be fundamental. It should not be slackened, he said, because the threat from the capitalists, from the Western powers, and from the hostile forces were ever present. And Stalin now began to see, and this becomes a dominant theme in his political and economic thinking in the 1930s, he began to see hostile capitalist forces encircling the Soviet Union. So building a socialist economy at home was a key part of modernizing the Soviet Union, but it also was a part of protecting it from these hostile outside forces. Modernity and security were two of the main themes of Stalinism that were pursued regardless of the human cost. The Stalinist economy had to be built quickly, and this meant that speed, or in Soviet terminology, tempo, was an important part of Stalin's message. Stalin declared the tempo must not be reduced. On the contrary, we must increase it as much as is within our powers and possibilities. To slacken the tempo would mean falling behind. And those who fall behind get beaten, but we do not want to be beaten. No, we refuse to be beaten. He referred back to moments when a more backward Russia had been beaten by hostile capitalist powers. And he now concluded, we are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or they crush us. So the tasks of business executives show some of Stalin's fears, which were ultimately shared by his comrades in the Communist Party. It also emphasized Stalin's desire for modernization. It highlights the fact that he had these reasons for wanting to build a strong country. And these reasons came from insecurity, from paranoia. These are two very dangerous factors when combined within a political context. Now, at the start of the 1930s, there was a clear need for industrialization. The economy had seen some improvements because of NEP. The economy had begun to grow. It had reached its pre-war levels in the mid-1920s. But there were also problems that had to be solved. There was an overpopulated, underproductive countryside. Rural migration had seen cities flooded with unskilled, discontented rural labourers. So there were growing social problems that came with the reintroduction of capitalism. Alcoholism, prostitution, gambling now all began to be key parts of Soviet life. Essentially, the worst problems of capitalism had come about or come back because of NEP. So NEP was now criticised from an ideological perspective. There was now a growing gap between the ideals of the Communist Party and the reality that was felt by ordinary Soviet citizens. And particularly for those more ideologically advanced, ideologically sound workers, there was no mass improvement fulfilling the promise of the October Revolution. So people were frustrated, especially from an ideological standpoint, especially here with the continuation of NEP. And these feelings grew. There was a need to address these negative features to resume the advance to socialism. At the same time, there was a move towards collectivization as well, and This was raised, I suppose, really because of the ideological aspects as well. Collectivization was ideologically desirable, and it was also necessary because it was deemed a core part of feeding the urban workers. It was a key part of the industrialization process. But there were disagreements amongst party comrades over agriculture. So when we look at the collectivization debate, we have people like Alexei Rykov and Mikhail Kalinin at the top here, who wanted to restructure the agricultural sector, but to proceed with care and caution. Others were not so careful. Stalin and Vyacheslav Molotov wanted to continue with a more hostile view. They had a more hostile view towards the peasantry. And Stalin talked about liquidating them as a class, reducing their power as a class, reducing their ability to participate in the economy and in wider society as a class. And Stalin began to talk about the kulaks. The word kulak is Russian for fist, or in this case, the tight fist, those who hold the money, those who hold the power. And so the term kulak began to enter Soviet demonology in the Stalin era. Stalin was especially wary of the peasantry. He saw that any peasant resistance to government policies as kulak sabotage. This would undermine socialism. It would threaten the survival of the Soviet state. Now, the issue here is at this time, there was a major problem in procuring grain. There was a shortage of manufacturing goods, and there was a reduction in the prices that the government would be willing to pay for grain. So the peasants began to hoard it. They'd keep their own stocks for themselves. They would eat their livestock rather than hand it over to the state. So Stalin began to use more and more coercive methods. And this was interpreted as an attack on the peasantry. There were grain seizures. There was the arrest of some kulaks. There was the attempts to force the peasantry onto collective farms. Stalin argued that cheap grain was necessary for industrialization to work. And so therefore the state had to ensure that it got the grain cheaply. Grain was also needed for exports. Cheap grain was needed for exports, which would allow the Soviet Union to bring in foreign money, which would then pile into the economy. So the kulaks became an obstacle to procuring this cheap grain. So there was now a clear move towards collectivization. Now, this had always been a part of the Soviet Union's ideals. It was always a part of the Communist Party's ideological advance to socialize the use of land for all. But there were other reasons for the party to decide to collectivize. Apart from it being ideologically desirable, voluntary collectivization of the Lenin years had proved to be unsuccessful in the 1920s. It was also part of Stalin's final victory in the post-Lenin power struggle. He used this to help defeat the right oppositionists, and there was a surge in radicalism from below. So revolutionary workers wanted an ideological approach to problem solving. And industries needed reliable grain deliveries and low prices, which could not be guaranteed with a strong kulak class. So there was a clear link between collectivization and industrialization, and the agricultural sector and the workers in the industrial sectors. So we can therefore see that collectivization was actually a wider part of the economy and part of industrialization as well. So the party was also committed to industrialization for a number of reasons. Again, it was ideologically crucial. It was necessary for the building of socialism, the creation of a proletariat. If you have an industrial working class, then the theory was that it would give its support back to the party that was ruling in its name. A planned economy was favoured. This would end the vagaries of free market capitalism. Militarily and strategically, this was seen as necessary. It was accelerating industrialization, which was needed to counter the threat from the hostile capitalist forces. And now there's an element of competition coming in as well. Socialism had to prove that it was superior to capitalism. And the Soviet Union was the leading socialist state, so therefore it came down to the Soviet Union to prove this. Now, this last point was especially relevant given the time frame that we're looking at here. We're thinking about the early 1930s, when there were economic changes occurring across the West because of the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. So the Great Depression seemed to confirm Karl Marx's proclamations about the collapse of capitalism and the victory of socialism. And this allowed a generally supportive mood to emerge amongst many workers. So industrialization was welcomed by many, as it was supposed to make the Soviet Union a more modern society. And in some ways, we can see this as part of the Soviet Union now joining the wider European Enlightenment project. And this is something that the historian Stephen Kotkin notes in his book, which is a story of how this huge new planned city of Magnitogorsk was, sorry, I just noticed something coming up on my screen about battery. Modernity. So modernity was a key part of the Stalinist project, and this great new industrial city that was built in the Ural Mountains was part of this wider goal of the Soviet project. So we see this ideal of a planned city beginning to emerge. The idea here was to establish a new and better society that would help to perfect humanity. Now, of course, while the Soviet Union did become a more modern society, paradoxically, for much of the process, the worst excesses of 19th century industrial capitalism were rolled into one within this decade. The emphasis again was on speed, and this meant that it was very difficult to be concerned with human cost with the rapid development of industrialization. So we must note that while many believed that they were creating a better future, Soviet industrialization was built on the foundations of slave labor, of force, and of coercion. So what were the key features of the Stalinist industrialization drive? Well, Stalin began to talk about the struggle for bread, which I'll come back to in a moment. This is a quote from about collectivization, where we see the links with industrialization. But there was the desire to eliminate the capitalist sector. There was a concentration on heavy industry, steel, coal, engineering, defense, the type of things that are going to make the Soviet Union secure. There was also the idea of a cult of metal within this leap forward. And Stalin was identified very clearly with this cult of metal. He took his name, Stalin wasn't his real name, he took his name from the Russian word for steel, which is Stal. So we have a cult of Stalin and a cult of metal. There was the reduction of consumption to the bare minimum. So everything was focused on heavy industry. There was very little consumer goods. There was the expansion of this plan across the Soviet Union. There was a concentration on massive projects that were created across, or creating new industrial sectors across the country. We have hydroelectric power schemes in places like the Dnieper River, Magnitogorsk, tractor factories springing up in Stalingrad, in Chelyabinsk, in Kharkov. And there was a huge investment in the infrastructure and the electrification of the country. There was also a mass mobilization of underutilized labor. There was a shift in the population from the rural communities to the urban areas, and towns were expanding on average by tens of thousands of people a week. There were also great changes in agriculture as well, as peasants were now being forced onto the collective farms in what was seen as an arbitrary attack on the peasantry. And this led to untold misery. Many non-kulaks were caught up in the revolutionary zeal of young urban party workers who were now sent to the countryside to coerce the peasants to join the collective farms, to persuade them that this was their future. And many non-kulaks were denounced by mistake. Hastily trained members of the Soviet youth who were trained at special 2-week courses were known as 25,000ers. This was because this was the number of the first delegation. One 25,000er, as you can see on the screen, Lev Kapelyev, who became a Soviet dissident later on, recalled what inspired him. He said, "Stalin had said the struggle for bread is the struggle for socialism. I was convinced that we were soldiers on an invisible front waging war on kulak sabotage for the sake of bread that the country needed for the 5-year plan." Now, by March 1930, the countryside was in chaos. There was desperate conflict between the agricultural sector and the industrial sector, between the agricultural workers, the peasants, the kulaks, and the party. The term kulak could now be applied to anyone suspected of resisting grain deliveries, anyone who was unwilling to join a collective farm. And this led to an enormous amount of resistance from the people and to struggles between them and the Communist Party. And ultimately, it led to many deaths. There was an enormous amount of resistance that from the peasants towards Moscow's demands. Again, peasants would slaughter their livestock, they would gorge on their own grain rather than hand it over to the party. The historian Lynn Viola has done an enormous amount of work on this. And she talks about the rebellions, the riots, the demonstrations against the party, against the government, the strikes that were taking place. She said there were over 13,500 mass disturbances and over 1,000 assassinations of officials and an enormous amount of protests and violence at collectivization meetings in 1930. However, again, in the industrial sector, there was more support for the Communist Party. Again, many people did believe that they were creating some kind of new civilization. The Great Depression seemed to confirm the superiority of Soviet socialism. And there were campaigns that sought to inspire people to work harder. And there were awards that were given out, like the Hero of Labour that was part of the Stakhanovite movement. So Alexei Stakhanov was a miner who cut an enormous amount of coal, and this became part of this wider Hero of Labour movement that was designed to generate enthusiasm, to get people on side, to follow people like Stakhanov. So what were the highs and lows of industrialisation? Well, there were certainly improvements. There was the fundamental transformation of the Soviet economy after the first 5-year plan. Hundreds of mining and engineering plants were established in places like the Urals and in the Volga region. The historian Chris Ward said that new factories materialised in empty lands of non-Russian republics scarcely touched by the modern world. So modernity was coming to the Soviet Union. Within the second 5-year plan, between 1932 and 1937, we see machine making and metalwork thriving. In the first 5-year plan, there were 1,500 new enterprises that were opened. In the second, there were 4,500. And labour productivity also rose. There were social improvements that came with this reconstruction. Sheila Fitzpatrick talks about Moscow being a showcase city of the Soviet Union. We have the construction of the first Moscow metro lines. And this was the country's proudest achievements. There were also trolley buses and trams and buses. In Moscow, we have 2/3 of Muscovites having been connected to running water by the start of the 1930s, and by the end, it was up to 3/4. New cities were springing up across the USSR within this rapid urbanization. And this meant that unemployment ended. Unemployment was planned away in the Soviet Union. And this was an extraordinarily powerful message for workers inside the Soviet Union who looked at what was going on in the West with the Great Depression and the enormous amount of unemployment that affected countries like Britain and Germany and the United States. but also for workers in those countries who were looking at the Soviet Union, and some now turn to the USSR as a future way of life, as a future model for development. It became a beacon of hope at a time of great crisis. And this massive expansion within the economy and within the cultural sector led to a huge education program. So there were literacy campaigns, which had a profound effect on both the Soviet system and the lives of workers. And this was part of a cultural revolution. By 1939, male literacy rate was up to 90.8% and female literacy had increased to 72.5%. This cultural revolution had established a system that was now being staffed by ordinary workers, not former owners, not specialists. And this saw workers begin to rise to power in three main areas of the system: in the industrial administration, within the government, and within the Communist Party itself. So there was an enormous amount of upward social mobility. People were moving into the growing economic bureaucracy. Of course, there were some failures that came with industrialization. There were some huge problems of industrialization as well. Certainly there were imbalances within the system. Some industries failed to advance, to grow, like the chemicals and textile industry. The system was very difficult to coordinate because orders came from the top down. There was no democracy, there was no democratic accountability, there was no democratic relationship between the workers, quite literally at the coalface, and the party in Moscow. And democracy was a crucial part of socialism. So without democracy, you can't have socialism. Coercive methods and slave labour was utilised. There was no consideration that was given to the living or working conditions of ordinary people. Housing was neglected. Families were pushed into communal apartments. Single families would move into rooms that were then divided up so more families could occupy the space, and they would share a kitchen, a bathroom and a toilet. The emphasis was also not on quality, it was on quantity. So what was produced was not always very good, and there were low living standards. Consumption was squeezed with this emphasis on heavy industry. So this means that this was not a step really towards establishing an efficient planned economy. Instead, it created confusion, panic and improvisation. Stalin's plan suffered from a lack of coordination. The historian Sheila Fitzpatrick talks about chaos as an almost dominant principle of Soviet development. She said, political leaders stagger from one unexpected crisis to another, pragmatically muddling through. If there were problems in the industrialization process, things were even worse in the agricultural sector. There were great costs that came with collectivization. In 1931, unauthorized food consumption was criminalized. In 1932, a person could now be executed for the theft of socialist property. And between 1931 and 33, there was a catastrophic decline in production as the state began to take more of what was produced. Perhaps the most significant cost, the greatest cost here, the main cost, was the famine of 1932 to 33 in Ukraine, Northern Caucasus, in Kazakhstan, and in the mid to lower Volga region. Between 5 and 7 million people died in this famine. The historian Robert Conquest talks about this being a deliberate policy by Stalin and the Communist Party to break the peasantry, to ensure a more compliant population. He refers to it as a terror famine. There's also the possibility it was an attack. It was used as an attack on Ukrainian nationalism, which Stalin feared as well. There is a significant argument against this viewpoint as well, though. The Communist Party obviously distrusted the peasantry. The party thought that they were hoarding grain and that they had enough grain to survive. But when the government finally realised that any hoarding of grain that had gone on had led to the grain reserves being depleted, it was too late for officials to do anything about it. Historians who put forward this argument, like R.W. Davies and Stephen Wheatcroft, highlight that there was simply not enough food reserves to give to the peasantry because of mistakes made elsewhere. So rather than being a deliberate attempt to break the peasantry, this was a disastrously mismanaged policy where the initial decisions taken in Moscow now had terrible consequences across large parts of the country. So it was the fault of human error, not a specific desire to crush the peasants. However we look at this tragedy, whether we see it as a deliberate attack on the peasantry or as a tragic consequence of a disastrously mismanaged policy, the historian Chris Reed is correct when he said, in terms of the loss of life, the famine of 1932-33 was the greater of the tragedies of the 1930s. So collectivisation came with a huge cost in human life and an enormous amount of suffering ran alongside it. It caused this suffering to those who survived the massive shift in the Soviet agricultural policy. It led to famine, to death, to demographic catastrophe, and to a psychological trauma and shock. And there was a significant erosion of the rural culture, of religion, of education, of the traditional structure of the Russian village. And it meant that the peasantry was now alienated from the regime. There was a use of arbitrary authority and coercion as it was used now as a method of problem solving. This was entrenched within the Stalinist system. There was an extraordinary amount of human suffering. And while Lenin had chosen to forge an alliance with the peasantry, Stalin broke the back of the peasants. Stalin chose a deliberate policy that would ensure the peasants wouldn't cause the party to slow the tempo as he sought to reconstruct the Soviet economy. So a couple of concluding thoughts. By the end of the 1930s, millions had died, millions more had had their way of life changed. And there was this enormous amount of suffering, especially in the countryside. Soviet modernity came with an enormous human price attached. The emphasis in the 1930s was very much on strengthening the state and the Soviet Union overall. Millions of people became little more than cogs in the overall Stalinist machine. But without this emphasis on heavy industry, the country could not have defeated the Nazis after 1941. It could not have become a nuclear superpower by the end of the 1940s. So overall, we can see that Stalin established in the Soviet Union a socialized economy that was controlled by the state, but which in theory placed power in the hands of the workers through the working class, through the Communist Party. But we have to question whether this is what Marx and Lenin meant by workers' power and socialism. So to return to the earlier question, we can ask whether Stalin did successfully build socialism and a socialist economy in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So I'll just shut my window as a massive lorry comes past. So what I'm going to do, and I do this for each session, give everyone a few minutes to think of a question that they would like to ask you, John. And while they do that, I've written down a few that I would like to put forward to. The answers might be short because the question's not incorrect, but I think I know potentially the answer. But one thing I was wondering is, obviously, you know, Stalinist Russia was successful in the sense that it did make it a power. It did make it able to compete with, say, the Nazis, join the space race, like you say, eventually. Did capitalist countries ever take on any of their ideas, or were the ideologies so different that, you know, they just simply couldn't?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Thanks, Rob. There is certainly evidence to suggest that planning became a core part of Western liberal democracy or social democracy, particularly after the Second World War. And we see with things like the Clem Attlee government in Britain with the welfare state and the National Health Service, the idea that a planned economy or a strong element of planning within the economy and in society would help to rebuild the country after the war. We see this idea becoming important in the 1930s with Keynesianism and the Keynesian idea of state intervention rather than individuals ruling their own lives and suffering or progressing as they see, as the economy allows or as society allows. So we certainly see an element of planning and a planned economy and building and reconstruction being used and inspired by the Soviet Union after the Second World War. But there was always it was always approached with caution because people didn't want to, always believed either, say in Britain, we can do it better, or there was this approaching it with caution because they didn't feel the necessity to go so far down the Soviet route, especially because there were these enormous curtailments on human liberty.
Great, thank you very much. And I guess as well, sort of a smaller question to ask before I move on to a couple more. Was the West aware of everything that was going on in Russia, i.e., the death it caused, the issues it caused, as well as sort of them becoming a power?
In some ways, yes. In many ways, no, because the Stalinist party was very good at hiding what was going on. So you had a lot of organised trips coming over from the West, a lot of organised trips with visitors, many who wanted to have their own views confirmed, especially when they see the unemployment and the problems in the West. They come to somewhere that has promised or has shown that planning works and there's no unemployment. Of course, behind the facade, there are enormous amounts of problems, a lot of suffering as well. But they're organised trips and they would see only the best. So it's hard to get to that story of suffering. But there were some brave journalists who were able to do this, or some who didn't believe this, some who didn't fall for it. People like Malcolm Muggeridge, who went, and Gareth Jones, the journalist, they were able to find the truth. But often when they came back, they found it difficult to publish their stories because there was the desire to believe the Soviet Union had planned away unemployment and was a success, especially within the rise of the Nazis. So we have to look at this within the wider context. So some people may have been willing to overlook some of the bigger problems in the Soviet Union because there was the rise of fascism and the Nazis were consolidating their power across Europe, and the Great Depression seemed to had caused an enormous amount of unemployment as well in the West. So people were willing to overlook some things in the Soviet Union, but they were certainly aware that it wasn't all quite as rosy as Stalin was making out.
Perfect, thank you. And sort of leading on from that, like I say, if anyone else has a question, please do type it away, but I've got a few written down. But with regards to the famine of 1932 and 33, I was just wondering if A, the West were aware of it, or whether that was something that Stalin was able to hide away, and B, considering it was the Great Depression, so I appreciate they may not have been able to do a lot, but did the West try to help? Did they try and send aid?
No, because it wasn't aware of it. Stalin hid the famine really well. Rob, you still there?
I am, sorry, yeah. Can you hear me?
It just says I've been signed out. Sure that you're still there. So the famine was hid by the party, and very few people in the Soviet Union knew what was going on because there was restriction of travel. Obviously, if you were in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, in other places that were affected by it, you knew exactly what was happening. And people like Gareth Jones, the journalist, was able to get down to Ukraine, and he reported on this, but he was denounced when he got home by people saying this was simply not true. So had the West known about it, it would be difficult to get aid because Stalin would have had to have requested it. Just on that point though, 10 years earlier, there was another enormous famine that was caused by the aggressive collectivization or agricultural restructuring policy of Lenin. And when that famine happened, there was a call for aid. There was an enormous amount of money that came in from the United States. There was an aid committee that was set up, and there was a huge amount of help that did come in. So had Stalin requested it, had Stalin been truthful and honest about the problems here, then I think that something could have been done about it. But at that time, there was the enormous suspicion that Stalin had of the West, and the suspicion that the West had of Stalin.
Thanks very much. And sort of leading on from that, like I say, if anyone else has a question, please do type it away, but I've got a few written down. But with regards to the famine of 1932 and 33, I was just wondering if A, the West were aware of it, or whether that was something that Stalin was able to hide away, and B, So I've had a couple of questions come in now. First one from Ava. How do you think the location of Russia and the Soviet Union influenced its communism and policies?
That's a great question. I think when you say the location, I assume you mean geographical location, so sort of being on the edge of Europe and within Eastern Europe. And it does have an impact. It does influence the way that the Communist Party's policies developed, partly because it had its own culture. Russia had its own culture that was 1,000 years old, but it was also part of Europe. So it kind of took elements of European ideals and mixed them with Russian ideals and Russian culture. And you have that kind of an interesting mix of Marxism and Moscow rule. So I think there are elements there that of modernity, but also a fight back against modernity, sort of an inherently conservative society. And so you don't have full-on socialism develop. You certainly don't have communism. But you do have an element of state control. Aspects of planning begin to become part of it after 1917 through to the 20s. But democratic planning doesn't take off. It doesn't exist because all of the power was within the Communist Party at the top. And that is very much a part of Soviet or Russian history as well. So when we're thinking about the geographical location, we have those traditions, European traditions that sort of cross over, but the power of the state was very important within that move to socialism. In terms of the geography, if that's where we're going with this question, again, I think it's a very deep question. Geographically, we can see that there were core regions that were good for industrialization, but perhaps, well, certainly collectivization should have been done more gradually, and the peasantry should have been taken along with the party. You have a lot of agricultural land, places like like Ukraine, often seen as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Had the relationship between Ukraine and the republics and the agricultural sector been better with Moscow, then again, we may have seen a more successful policy, a sort of more successful implementation of that policy. I hope that answers your really good question. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And now another question here from Bryn. In your opinion, did Stalin genuinely want communism, or was it just a front for his totalitarianism?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. And that's I think that's one of the key questions that is often asked and discussed and debated by historians. It's very difficult to come to a conclusion because Stalin was not a great writer. I mean, he wrote a lot, but he wasn't a great thinker in the same ways as, say, Lenin or Trotsky or Bukharin, other intellects of the party. But I think there was a desire at the start to follow the Bolshevik ideals, to create a different type of society. But coming back to Ava's question, it's very difficult to create socialism in this context without it spreading. And so it's impossible to build socialism in one country, which was a core part of Stalin's program. So I think that there was a desire to follow a socialist path. I don't think the Soviet Union was a totalitarian state. That takes us into a whole different area. But there was an enormous amount of repression, coercion, force that was used, certainly a lack of democracy. And I think once Stalin gives up on that belief in democracy, once Stalin gives up on the belief that there should be democratic accountability, then the idea that Stalin was trying to build socialism has to be challenged, and I think has to be defeated, because socialism and democracy go together. You can't have a socialist state without democracy. So once Stalin does away with that and the party is unaccountable, then he's not pursuing socialism. He does create a socialized economy in the 1930s, but that's different to socialism. So that's a very long-winded way of saying he wasn't trying. I don't think he was trying to create this oppressive state that we associate with totalitarianism. And what he did with things like the purges, the terror, were in his mind justified because he saw these hostile capitalist forces and threats everywhere. But he certainly wasn't trying to pursue the socialism of Marx and Lenin. I hope that answers the question. Thank you, Bryn.
Well, thanks very much. I've got one more question as well. It gives people a bit more time if they want to think of any more before we wrap up for today. But I was just wondering, you mentioned about Stalin focusing more on quantity rather than quality. And again, this sort of harps back to that idea of how isolationist were they, as the Soviet Union. But with regards to trade, did it affect trade if they were trying to trade goods that weren't as good quality, or did that not matter?
It didn't matter quite so much. It wasn't so much that the Soviet Union was trading in consumer goods. Consumer goods didn't matter and weren't produced. What the Soviet Union had was an abundance of raw materials, so steel and timber and grain, things like that. So going back to the question about the famine, grain was being exported to the West to bring in money, which meant that when the officials realised there wasn't enough grain and that the peasants hadn't actually been hoarding it, there just wasn't enough to feed them. Then the second part of that meant that there wasn't enough to feed them once that realisation had occurred. So it wasn't that the Soviet Union was fantastic in making clothes or boots or something like that and then selling it for profit. It was still able to sell its raw materials. So there certainly was trade going on between East and West, and that continued during the Cold War as well. So trade can often be a way of getting around certain ideological issues. So it was isolationist to some extent, but at the same time, once the Nazis became more of a power in the 1930s, it was brought back in and it joined into this sort of the family of nations, and it joined the League of Nations in 1934.
Well, thanks very much. And another question here from Ava. What do you think about how Stalin and communism paved the way for Putin and his current government?
What a brilliant question. I don't think it paved the way for Putin, but Putin has used Stalin in a particular way, and he has almost rehabilitated Stalin to some extent, or aspects of Stalin. So I don't think we can say that Putin is going back to the Soviet Union or Soviet days, certainly not. But there is an element of authoritarianism within Putin's Russia and within Putin's mindset that is sort of reminiscent of those days. So he's using Stalin in the same way that Stalin used great figures like Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great, hard czars who used harsh methods to achieve modernity. So there's that argument there that, yes, people may have suffered, but Russia was greater at the end of it. Russia was stronger. And Putin is saying the same things, or has used Stalin in a similar sort of way, to say that, yes, of course, we're not trying to say that there weren't purges and terror, that there weren't huge problems and lots of suffering, but the policies of Stalin and the policies that he pursued left the Soviet Union in a much stronger state. So, as I said, by 1949, it's a nuclear superpower. It's able to be a core part. It's the second superpower in the Cold War. So I think Putin is sort of using Stalin and Stalin's memory in that way, rather than pursuing actual policies of Stalinism. So it doesn't quite pave the way for Putin's Russia, but Putin is certainly using Stalin in a very clever or a very deliberate way. And to some extent, that's very popular. So a lot of polls in Russia over the last few years have shown that Stalin is actually more popular than we would perhaps have been, than we would assume. And so this rehabilitation or partial rehabilitation of Stalin has been successful, and it has allowed Putin to largely do what he wants. So that's a really fascinating question. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, John. What I'm going to start doing now is, in case anyone has any more questions, they can really frantically start typing them away. But I will start to bring the session to an end by just saying thank you very much for leading that session, John. Really appreciated and really enjoyed. As someone that studied Stalin's Russia at A-level, it was nice to come back to it. Always a fascinating topic that I think you could spend years, to be honest, just reading about it and looking into it. Thank you also to those of you that have come with us today and joined us. It's really much appreciated. We hope you've enjoyed the session and or sessions if you've been to them during the week as well. If you're joining us for our last session today, we look forward to seeing you then. But otherwise, unless anyone has a frantic question they want to type away, we will end the session there. And I'll say have a lovely day. Oh, we have got one.
Wow.
No, we haven't. Sorry, I just came up with the last comment, which was thank you. And the answer was really helpful from Ava. So with that, we will end the session there. I think, John, you have the power to end the session for everyone. You've got a red button at the bottom that says end session, and you can end for all. So I'll let you do that.
It might take me a while. I'm not very used to it.
That's all right. If people want to leave, they can do it.
Yeah, please do. It might take some time. Okay,
you don't want to sit and watch John doing that. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day.
Thanks, Rob.